Federal ministers are updating the efforts to fight wildfires across the country. Let's listen in.
Mais il doit être sauf pour avoir le return.
Just, Minister, I know you, or I think from the readout, there was an update overall on the outlook on fires. Could you just update us on what Cabinet was told in terms of the outlook for the next few months? Is this, have we seen the worst of it, or where are we at in the season?
So I think Mike Norton in my department actually provided an update last week on the forecast, and we will be continuing to provide updates on that. By and large, we see continuing dry and hot weather, which obviously create circumstances that are conducive to the generation of fires, particularly from sort of eastern Quebec across the western part of the country. And so, you know, we certainly hoped that we will see changes in that forecast, but the forecast would tell us that we're going to have to be very cautious and very thoughtful, and potentially be capable of addressing additional fires that may come.
A question to Mr. Wilkinson again. As you know, a lot of trees were burnt down with the forest. I think it's 11 million hectares that were destroyed by the forest fire. Does that mean that you have to rethink your planting program of 2 billion trees, or even increase or come up with a new program to replace this forest that was burnt down?
Yeah, I think it's actually the most recent figure I saw, which was from probably a week ago, is 13.4 million hectares. So it's a lot of forest that has been affected. What I would say is we are thinking very actively about how we can use the 2 billion tree program to reforest some of these areas that have been impacted by the forest fires, in the same way that we're doing that with respect to trees, for example, that were impacted by Hurricane Fiona. I actually just signed an agreement with Prince Edward Island on trees, and many of those are going into areas that were impacted by Hurricane Fiona. But absolutely, we are thinking about how we can use that program in a manner that will help us to restore some of the forests and the habitat that was affected this year.
Are you thinking about increasing the number of trees you would like to plant over the next few years as a result of the fires?
Well, I mean, that's probably a conversation for a day or two down the road. But what I would say, though, is it has been an enormous lift to actually get the 2 billion trees program up and running. And part of that is just getting the infrastructure going, because it takes 2 or 3 years to grow the seedlings before you can actually start to plant them. I think we're pretty happy with the progress we've made. We think it's a very important program, not just for fighting climate change, but for the restoration of habitat. And so definitely it is a critically important program. Whether that gets expanded is probably something to discuss down the road.
Ms. Haidu, the President of the Treasury Board has been told to fund $15 billion worth of savings. Is there money you think in your department that can be cut, or are you comfortable with the idea that there will be cuts to departments?
Well, I think, look, Canadians expect us to tighten our belts and to look for every ounce of savings that we possibly can. That's what Canadians are doing right now, by the way, and it's certainly not an unfamiliar process to many departments in Ottawa. What I would say is that it's important for me as Minister of Indigenous Services in the file that I hold that it doesn't impact the service delivery to Indigenous people in Canada. Indigenous Services Canada, if you can think of it in the way of a province, provides the same kinds of services that provinces provide to Canadians in their jurisdiction. So things like healthcare on reserve, and things like education and infrastructure support and maintenance, all of those things are supported through Indigenous Services Canada. And I would say that there is a huge gap between the quality of life for Indigenous people on reserve and non-Indigenous people in municipalities still. So we'll be really thoughtful at Indigenous Services Canada about how we look for those savings. Obviously, we can look for duplication in terms of the kinds of roles that civil servants are playing, or various different departmental functions that are not servicing directly the supports for Indigenous Services Canada delivery of programs. But I've been very clear throughout government that obviously if we're really talking about ensuring that everybody has a fair chance to succeed, that we have a huge gap to close for Indigenous people on reserve, and that's my focus in this exercise.
Have you been told that you need to find money in your department to cut?
I think every department has the same direction, and for every minister, it is an exercise in thoughtfulness about how to achieve that goal without impacting services to Canadians, and my department is no different.
Can you just clarify, does that mean, so you're not expecting any program cuts in terms of anything that would be a direct program for Indigenous people from the spending
I would not
review?
make that recommendation as a minister to impact services that are delivered directly to people living in First Nations. We're talking about quality of water, we're talking about education, we're talking about healthcare in nursing stations, we're talking about programs that prevent suicide and address mental health. Those things are critically important and currently still really struggling, quite frankly, to meet the needs of First Nations. And so for me, the focus will be on making sure that we're not in any way undermining or restricting the ability for the department to continue to work with First Nations in delivering those services.
To be clear, that's the case you're making to
Do you intend to comply with this request from
Of
your
course, we're
colleague?
going through the exercise. As I said, every minister is expected to look for savings. For me, the red line is anything that affects the quality of life for First Nations
But
people.
that's your advice to your cabinet colleagues, or that's your commitment? Like, is your, I just want to.
Right now, we've been listening to some federal ministers updating the ongoing efforts to fight the wildfires across the country. We'll have more on what some of those ministers had to say throughout the morning and afternoon.